Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. Sheetec, Wisconsin, Saturday, April the 8th, 2023, 3:38 p.m. Glenn Perry was a 50-year-old with problems. According to his ex-wife, she thought he was a schizophrenic, that he talked to stuff that wasn't there. She also said he slept with a gun under his pillow and carried guns in his vehicle. And the claim about the guns was also corroborated by an ex-girlfriend of Perry's. She said he had 5 guns in the trunk of his car and that he bought guns every week. She said he told her the country was going to war. According to the sheriff's department, law enforcement had multiple run-ins with Perry, from traffic stops to calls from his now ex-wife. Perry's divorce was a really ugly affair, with Perry having been accused of stalking his ex-wife and harassing her, and even trying to fight the police. One of Perry's friends said that his ex-wife accused him of domestic abuse and being a bad father. This friend also said that Perry was upset with the courts over child support payments. Though I noticed in all of the white media's coverage about this man, nobody used the phrase deadbeat dad. On March 30th of this year, Perry failed to appear for a hearing regarding the months of child support payments that he was behind on, and so the judge issued a bench warrant for his arrest. On April 7th, a captain with the Barron County Sheriff's Office sent out an email alert saying that Glenn Perry was wanted on a warrant and that officers should use caution when dealing with him because he was known to be armed and his mental status was in decline. That afternoon, Sheetec police officer Emily Breidenbach spotted Perry's vehicle. She radioed for backup. Cameron police officer Hunter Shield responded also. Dispatch relayed the warning about Perry, but it's unknown whether Breidenbach acknowledged the transmission. They pulled Perry over on the highway. Breidenbach got out of her vehicle and began yelling commands at Perry. Perry got out of his vehicle and began opening fire on the officers with an AR-15. Breidenbach only got to radio that Perry had a gun before she was fatally shot. Officer Shield was also exchanging gunfire with Perry. During the shootout, Perry had been shot in the right leg. The bullet severed his femoral artery. He began bleeding profusely, but even so, he shot Officer Shield multiple times, and then after Shield was down, Perry shot him twice at close range, killing him. The incident lasted only 45 seconds. More police units converged on the scene. By this time, Perry was himself unable to walk due to blood loss, and he fell to the ground. He was taken to the hospital where he was later pronounced dead. And you won't be surprised to learn this guy has priors. He was charged in 2020 with domestic battery and disorderly conduct following an altercation with his estranged wife and 2 of their children. One of Perry's children said he threatened to kill them if they ever called the police on him. Now, as was mentioned earlier in this crime report, Glenn Perry had legally purchased a small arsenal of guns. But like Dylan Roof and so many others of these killers, Glenn Perry wasn't even supposed to be able to do so. A decade ago, he had been prohibited from possessing firearms after having been committed to a mental health facility. In fact, Perry's own father said the family had been trying to get him committed again at the time that he killed those cops. In fact, it was Perry's father who warned the police that he felt his son's mental health was deteriorating. So any way you want to slice it, there were all kinds of red flags going off with this guy. The police, his neighbors, his own friends, everyone saying that this guy wanted to fight the police. One of Perry's friends said that he had told him that if the cops ever tried to pull him over, he was going to basically go out in a blaze of glory and kill as many police as he could. This is the guy who they allowed to stay on the streets, not because they didn't know, but because there's a system of racial privilege in place that makes it where these guys are practically untouchable. Also, as is the case with so many of these crimes, Sheetec is a city of about 2,200 people roughly 9 miles southeast of Cameron. So this is yet another rural bloodletting taking the lives of 3 people. But guess what? That wasn't the only killing of police in Wisconsin this year. Only a few weeks after Perry's double murder, a St. Croix Sheriff's deputy, Katie Lysing, was killed by a man named Jeremiah Johnson, an ex-convict who had done time for rape and kidnapping. In fact, Jeremiah Johnson was predictably a career criminal, with a path of destruction going all the way back to 2006. There were at least 22 cases involving this man in Wisconsin, and yet somehow he was still on the streets. Here's how she died. Johnson had gotten drunk and ran his vehicle into a ditch. Deputy Lysing responded to the call, and she talked to Johnson for 8 minutes. After this 8 minutes of conversation, Johnson decided to pull a gun and shot her. He then fled into the woods. When police caught up to him, he shot himself and died. Now, something to know about this rapist Johnson. When you check his social media, he posted memes defending the Confederate flag, and he also posted memes demanding to know what was wrong with white pride. This cop killer was a Yankee, not a Southerner. He was from Minnesota. And yet, as we saw with the so-called anti-COVID quarantine protest in Michigan in 2020, it became excruciatingly clear that a lot of those so-called protesters were in fact white nationalists. They were in the state of Michigan, a state that is so far to the north that there's actually parts of Canada that are geographically to the south of that state, and yet you had people running around with the Confederate flag and other white nationalist imagery. But hey, the Confederate flag isn't about race, right? It's all about Southern pride, which is why white Northerners who have never set foot south of Wisconsin love it so much, because we all know how Minnesota and Wisconsin were part of the Confederacy, right? Plenty of Southern pride in those Yankee states, right? Though while going over Johnson's Facebook account, I did happen to find some other posts that were disturbing for other reasons. Too many times whenever you got one of these Confederate flag-waving, black community-hating white supremacists running around, they always seem to have some black significant other close by. They like to use black people as their little shield to ward off any accusation of racism, and too many black folks play right along with the okey doke, not realizing or more likely just refusing to see how close to death their love affair with these white supremacists brings them. So in the span of a month, there's been at least 3 law enforcement personnel killed in the state of Wisconsin alone, and it wasn't black men who did it. That's important because you have all these white supremacists in these police departments, and not to mention in these white right-wing hate spheres, people like Heather McDonald who try to justify the killing of black people by saying, oh, well, black people are killing all the cops in America, when the numbers make it clear that's a lie. 3 cops killed in Wisconsin in the span of only a month, and Wisconsin is not the biggest state. And yet you don't have Fox News talking about a war on cops. Where is Heather McDonald with more of her copaganda about how black people are targeting the police? Cops getting gunned down left and right. Where's the war on cops rhetoric at? Yeah, you got a lot worse problems now than whether or not somebody wants to defund the police, which, by the way, nobody has done. They push all of those lies to defend killers like Derek Chauvin, murderers like Michael Slager and others. Yeah, no talk about a war on cops now when there's actually one going on. And by the way, many of the people that you have in these white supremacist organizations are in law enforcement themselves. Members of terrorist groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys have a lot of police officers in their ranks. And these organizations make it a point to go after black people. What needs to be remembered is that these terrorist groups don't have their members infiltrate law enforcement. They don't have to. It was these racist cops who decided to organize themselves into terrorist groups. Police and sheriff's departments have long been breeding grounds for these anti-black white supremacist gangs. And some of these race soldiers decided to give their gangs cutesy little names like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. They're at war with black people, but who is it who's gunning them down in the streets? It's people like this Perry fellow and this Johnson reprobate. Racist punks who stockpile tons of guns, who say the country is at war, and who openly show their contempt for the very police who the white right tells us black people pose the greatest threat to. Because all of those racist and Confederate-loving memes that Jeremiah Johnson posted are just like the kind that so many police have been caught posting on their social media over the years. A lot of cops claim not to be racist, but the problem is too many of them think nothing of having other people in these departments who run around with Confederate flag tattoos or Confederate flag shirts under their uniforms or posting racist messages on the internet, or in many cases just openly making anti-black racist statements. The vast majority of police who are killed in the U.S. are killed by people like Glenn Perry and Jeremiah Johnson. But because of the rampant culture of anti-black racism in these departments, they would rather focus on harassing and imprisoning black people instead. The cost of practicing racial hypocrisy is very high. How do you change this situation when the very police who are being killed are not committed to the law, but rather to using their position to harass and imprison black people as a way of enforcing a system of societal oppression based on race? These creeps like Perry and Johnson should never have been on the streets, and if they were black, they wouldn't have been. But part of white supremacy is that the police and the courts give slaps on the wrist based entirely on race. This way, people classified as white will be able to move about and live far more freely than black people. And this racial discrimination is not accidental. It is deliberate and aggressively enforced, but it's not harmless, even to the people who practice it. People like Glenn Perry and Jeremiah Johnson depend on genetic immunity from law. Committing rape and kidnapping, predictably the courts will let them plead it down. They do a small sentence, then it's back on the streets where they can live their lives as if nothing had happened. Johnson, it turned out, was a local businessman. Police and prosecutors insist on being lenient based on race, and that emboldens the criminal class, the Glenn Perrys and the Jeremiah Johnsons of this world. But when people are systematically allowed to be exempt from the law, and they know they're exempt from it, they become indignant and then violently opposed to any attempts to hold them to account. It seems paradoxical that so many people in the dominant society, who are constantly given a pass and a hands-off policy by the police, are the first ones to be furious at the police for pulling them over for, say, drunk driving, or for some other small thing. Because as they see it, that's not supposed to happen at all. And why shouldn't they berate the police, or, as in the case of Glenn Perry, attack the police for demanding that they pay their child support? Because this society has conditioned the Glenn Perrys and the Jeremiah Johnsons to bear no consequences for their behavior. And while it may be comforting to these police departments to repeat the racist copaganda that black people are the biggest threat to people in law enforcement, or to try to justify the killing of black people with the idea that black people are the criminal class in America, all they've accomplished with these racist denials is to give the Glenn Perrys and the Jeremiah Johnsons a clear lane and an open field to commit their murders. As a result, tragically, America's police departments have chosen to make their own officers into human sacrifices on the altar of racial privilege. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Noel Williams, Sabrina, Marshall, Richard Allen Lavelle, and Mark Anderson. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.